Hi, my name is Steve Havey with Havey Outdoors. In this recording, I'll be going over a test we ran earlier this year on arrow speed versus weight and which one matters most. There will be a lot of information presented to you, so I would have some paper and something to write with. I hope you enjoy this recording and that you learn some good stuff from it. Thanks for listening. All right, so arrow speed versus weight, which one matters the most? So a little background behind my test was earlier this year I bought a newer bow, I upgraded. I used to shoot a Matthews Switchback XT, and recently I upgraded to a Matthews No-Cam HTR. And when I got the bow, I decided to bring it into my local archery shop just to have them go through it and make sure everything was working right and to give it a little tune up. And I took it into the technician, and he said, was kind of questioning why I bought this bow. Why didn't I buy a newer bow that shoots faster? He said my bow shoots really slow, and that he wouldn't have wasted money on it. So I'm like, what are you talking about? This bow shoots slow. It shoots 300, its IBO is 330 feet per second, which is blazing fast in my opinion. My switchback was shooting 315, and I shoot traditional archery, and my traditional bow I'm pulling back 54 pounds at 30 inches, and that one's flinging a 570 grain arrow at 160 right around feet per second. So an IBO of 330 is double what my traditional bow is shooting. And, obviously I'm not going to shoot an IBO arrow, but to me, that's like more than enough. I mean, that's super fast. And, I didn't really know what he was talking about, but he's a salesman, and I got to talking with him a little bit more. And about his setup, of course, he's shooting the brand new Matthews Vertex, which is a really nice bow as well. But I shot that, and the axle to axle on that just a little bit short for me. I'm a taller guy. I like the little bit longer axle to axle. I've got a longer draw length, and the no cam HDR fit me really nice. So that's what I went with. And anyway, talking with him a little bit more, I found out that he's shooting arrow. He's trying to get his arrow as close to IBO specs as possible. Why? He wants to be shooting a super fast arrow out of a super fast bow so that the game animal has less time to duck his arrow or to dodge. So it got me to thinking, how much time really does a game animal have if you're shooting, like, say, I think he said his arrow is right around 370 grains compared to, say, one of my arrows. Usually out of my compound, I like to shoot a little bit heavier arrow, right around 530 grains. So what is the time difference between those two arrows? So I decided to do some tests, and what I did was for my test setup, I used, of course, my Matthews no cam bow, and I had that set at IBO specs. My draw weight was at 70 pounds, and I have a 30-inch draw length. My IBO rating, of course, on this bow I said was 330 feet per second. The arrows I was shooting out of them, and I used the same arrows for the entire test because that does make a difference. Arrow diameter, fletching, there's a few variables with arrows that will increase or decrease speed, so I wanted to use the exact same arrows. But for my arrows, I used Black Eagle Spartans. I cut them at 29 inches, and those Spartans have a spine of 300 and a weight of 9 grains per inch. So to change the weight of the arrows, I used field points, different weighted field points, and the weights that I used were 100 grains, 125, 150, 175, and 200 grains. For my arrow, the insert weight was 28 grains, my bushing weight was 10 grains, my nock was 9 grains, and I had 3 vanes on there for a total of 18 grains. They weighed 6 grains each. So once my arrow was set up, I took it over to my arrow scale, and I weighed each arrow and all components installed. And you can see that on the screen, the weights, but my lightest weight was 429.45 grains, and my heaviest weight was 529.51 grains. And that's basically my hunting arrow. Like I said, I like to hunt with a little bit heavier arrow. So in addition to my test, I also ran numbers from an IBO arrow. Now, I didn't want to shoot an IBO arrow out of my bow, and I actually didn't have an IBO arrow, but I purchased the archery program, archery calculation program, and I found that to be fairly accurate. So I just ran some numbers with my bow, exact same setup, with a 350 grain arrow on that program, and I came up with some numbers from that. So my arrows, the front of center for each of my arrows hit lightest to heaviest, and you can see that on the screen right now as well. My lightest was 10.77%, and my heaviest was 17.8%. So each arrow I shot 3 times into targets set at 10, 20, 30, and 40 yards. I didn't go further than that. I figured 40 yards would be a good break off point, but I could do further tests to go out to 60 yards to see exactly what happens there. But in these tests, I definitely noticed the trend, and I can pretty much guarantee I can tell you exactly what those arrows will do once it gets out to 60 yards. So I averaged the time it took each arrow to get to hit the target. So I shot 3 arrows in my 10-yard target, took times for each of those arrows and averaged them. To determine my speeds and the time that it took the arrow to exit my bow and hit the target, I used sound. Sound, I found is extremely accurate. Um, I could watch the sound waves. I recorded it with a Rode VideoMic Pro. Well, then watch the sound waves when I was working at it in post. And by viewing the sound waves, I could tell the exact moment down to the millisecond that the knock left the string to when the tip, the point, hit the target. So I could tell exactly down to the millisecond. It was extremely accurate. Plus, I really didn't want to shoot an arrow through my chronometer at 40 yards. Just, I would hate to stick my chronometer. So by recording the shot with sound, I was able to get an extremely accurate representation or time frame when the arrow leaves the bow to when it hits the target. So that was basically my test setup. So I took this test a few steps further by calculating other variables that affect the flight of an arrow, as well as the reaction time of game species. One of those variables was drag. So due to air density, gravity, wind, humidity, etc., an arrow will experience speed loss during flight. I calculated this via speed loss formulas for each variable and subtracted the differences in time it took the arrow to hit the target at each distance. So an example of that would be my heaviest arrow, my 529.51 grain arrow, exited my bow at 270.94 feet per second. With no drag in an ideal world, my arrow would reach the 10-yard target in 0.1107 seconds. However, it took the arrow 0.1120 seconds to reach the 10-yard target. That's a difference of 0.0013 seconds. So, I mean, this number is extremely small. However, it does represent a time variable and the drag an arrow experiences during flight. So as a rule of thumb, as distance increases, arrow speed will decrease as it experiences a longer duration of drag. In an ideal world, like I mentioned, with no speed loss, we'll just say 530 grain arrow would fly a constant 271 feet per second throughout its entire flight path, and it would experience absolutely no drag. A second variable that we took into consideration was the speed of sound. So if a game animal does not see you take the shot, the only way it will know a shot was taken is to hear it. The speed of sound is 1,125.33 feet per second. At 10 yards, the sound of the shot will reach the game animal in 0.027 seconds. Once again, this is an extremely small number, but it represents another time variable. I took this into account when determining the time a game animal has to react to the shot. Once again, as with drag, as distance increases, so does the time it takes for that sound to reach the animal, and that'll give the animal more time to react to the shot. The third and last variable I took into consideration was reaction time. For this, there are quite a few variables in reaction time. Some of them can't be calculated, such as the individual response of an animal. And what that is, each animal responds differently to the sound stimulus. So say there's been a deer that's been shot at multiple times by a hunter with his bow. That deer is going to recognize the sound much faster and react to it much faster than, say, another whitetail that has never been shot at before. So that is one variable that we couldn't calculate for, and then that was the individual response of an animal. For reaction time, I took the time in milliseconds it takes for an animal to register noise, and what a millisecond is 0.001 seconds, and for the neurons to carry that to the brain. After reading many scientific articles, I felt confident that the reaction time of a rat would easily account for that of a deer. Rats' reaction times are much faster. As a rule of thumb, the smaller the animal, the faster the reaction time, just due to the distance that the neurons have to carry the signal around the animal's body. It's much shorter for like a smaller animal. So as a general rule of thumb, smaller animals have faster reaction times, and rats have one of the fastest reaction times in the animal kingdom. A rat's reaction time, so the time that it takes for the rat to register noise and for that to carry to the brain, was 10 milliseconds or 0.01 seconds. I also took into account the time it takes the neurons to carry the signal from the brain back to the muscles and for the muscles to contract, and that this time was 40 milliseconds or 0.04 seconds. This is in a perfect world. It doesn't take into account the surprise factor, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but what the surprise factor is would be if an animal is feeding completely calm, doesn't know you're there, you shoot the arrow, and it completely takes the animal by surprise, doesn't isn't aware of you at all. So this doesn't take into account that. So what this would take into account is once the sound hits the animal, it instantly knows what it is, instantly reacts, and basically in a perfect setup for that animal. So once again, the smaller animal has a faster reaction time. So there's a few things I'd like to talk about and some stuff that we found from this test. But the first one I'd like to talk about is kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is the amount of energy an arrow possesses and transfers to its target. The lethality of an arrow has very little to do with the kinetic energy it possesses. However, on the flip side of that, kinetic energy is a very important variable for the lethality of a bullet. Watching a bullet hit ballistic gel at super slow motion, or even watching it before it hits the ballistic gel, you can see all of that kinetic energy, all of that energy from the bullet transfer into the ballistic gel and send shock waves throughout the gel. That is kinetic energy that the gel is absorbing from the bullet. Bullets travel at such a velocity that the energy it transfers to the gel or animal is enough to send a lethal amount of energy into the tissues surrounding the path of the bullet. So what makes a bullet deadly is just that energy that it carries and transfers to the animal, and that is due to the velocity of the bullet. Arrows, on the other side, don't carry enough energy or velocity to do this. An arrow's lethality comes from its broadhead design and the broadhead's durability, the arrow design, and the arrow penetrating power and its flight. According to the charts I could find online on kinetic energy required to harvest big game animals, all our arrows had more than enough, sometimes even double, to harvest any big game species in North America. Even my IBO arrow had more than enough kinetic energy to harvest any North American big game species, as well as Cape buffalo. So this made me question really how useful is kinetic energy for the archer. Running some further tests, I used the ballistics of a 42 grain 22 round with an exit velocity of 1220 feet per second. The kinetic energy result I got back from my calculations was 138.78 foot-pounds. This, according to the kinetic energy required to harvest big game charts, was double the amount of kinetic energy required to harvest grizzly, moose, or even Cape buffalo. However, the momentum for the round was grossly inadequate at 0.229 pounds-seconds for harvesting any game species. Therefore, from our findings, kinetic energy is really a direct component of velocity and the shock factor of the projectile hitting the target. For kinetic energy to be lethal, basically you need high velocities, and those velocities are unattainable by an arrow. Now, an arrow and a bullet obviously are two completely different projectiles. However, we looked at some kinetic energy charts required for bullet energy to harvest an elk and found that generally right around 1,200 foot-pounds is required to harvest an elk. That's kind of what's agreed on by the hunting world and by a few other um, articles that we read. And that basically is a number that cannot be achieved even with the most advanced bow and arrow setup. So I also put my bow numbers in the archery calculator, and instead of using a 350 grain arrow, I dropped that arrow down to 200 grains just to see what kind of kinetic energy I was going to get out of that. Obviously, that flung my arrow much faster, and the kinetic energy that the program calculated was 61.4 foot-pounds, which, according to the kinetic energy required to harvest big game charts, was enough to harvest any North American large game species around the size of an elk. That's, to me, is like throwing a piece of straw or flinging a piece of straw at a big game species. I made some additional calculations and discovered that a heavier arrow retains more of its kinetic energy the further it is shot versus a lighter arrow. The difference between the lightest arrow and the heaviest arrow was 2.244 foot-pounds at 10 yards, 2.317 at 20 yards, 3.014 at 30 yards, and 3.260 foot-pounds at 40 yards. And you can see that in the chart. So as you can see, as distance increases, foot-pounds also increase. The gap between the lighter arrow and the heavier arrow increases. So the heavier arrow is much more efficient at keeping that kinetic energy. Another thing I'd like to talk about is momentum. And this, as far as we're concerned, is the key. Momentum is a measurement of the force an arrow carries into the target, and this is measured in pounds seconds. As a rule of thumb, the heavier the arrow, the more momentum it carries into the target. So similar to kinetic energy, as the arrow flight path increases in distance, the momentum difference between the two arrows also increases, or the heavier arrow is more efficient at retaining its momentum. As momentum increases, so as the pound seconds increase, the force required to stop an arrow increases. So therefore, an arrow carrying greater momentum will penetrate further into its target. As hunters, our goal honestly is to get clean arrow pass-throughs, a big entry channel or a big entry point, a big exit point, and a big wound channel going through. And we want that to cause as much damage as possible. Momentum is the key for this. Having an arrow carrying a greater degree of force also helps arrow penetration for the time arrow finds bone or cartilage. So if you're shooting a lighter arrow and you hit a rib with it, you might have a lot of kinetic energy, but you don't have a lot of momentum to carry that arrow through that rib or through that shoulder blade. If you're shooting a heavier arrow, you're not going to have quite as much kinetic energy, but you're going to have the momentum to blow through that bone or blow through that shoulder blade. And this is key. You want that penetration. That's in an ideal world. Obviously, your arrows aren't going to get clean pass-throughs every time, but that's what we try to shoot for. And if it's not going to get a clean pass-through, you want it to penetrate into the animal as deep as possible. So along with momentum, broadhead design, as well as arrow design and diameter, also play a factor in the distance an arrow will penetrate the target. And we'll be discussing this in a further article. We're running tests on this right now, and I'll be posting another recording of this in the future. Another variable I'd like to talk about is arrow arc. So I compared the fastest arrow, and this is an IBO arrow. This was actually one of my arrows, 429.45 grains to my slowest arrow, and this was my hunting arrow, 529.51 grains, to see the change and rise along the flight path. The difference between the two arrows was 1.22 inches at 10 yards, 1.61 inches at 20 yards, 1.21 inches at 30 yards, and both the arrows zeroed out at my 40-yard target. These numbers are super small and likely not to be of great concern during a hunt as far as I'm concerned, but we all know that there are so many variables in hunting, even a hundredth of an inch with the flight path of an arrow. If the arrow is up a little bit higher than the other one, a hundredth of an inch, that could hit a branch and completely change the flight path of the arrow. So that can be a major difference. However, is that a big enough difference? Is 1.61 inches a big enough difference to me to get a lighter, flatter shooting arrow? I would say no every single day. Momentum is huge as far as I'm concerned, much more important than the flight path of an arrow. All right, another one I'd like to talk about is arrow speed, and this is our whole test right here. This is why we ran the test. The exit speed difference between my heaviest arrow, 529.51 grains, and my lightest arrow, 429.45 grains, was 26.19 feet per second. The time difference between the two arrows at 10 yards was 10 milliseconds, at 20 yards, 20 milliseconds, at 30 yards, 28 milliseconds, and at 40 yards, 37 milliseconds. The average blink of an eye is between 100 and 400 milliseconds. So the time difference between the slowest and fastest arrow is faster than the fastest blink of an eye, and as far as I'm concerned, doesn't even play a minor role in choosing an arrow. If you're going to choose an arrow and you want a speed arrow, so you're getting a lighter arrow, it doesn't really even play even a minor role in this time an arrow is going to get to your target. As you can see too, the time difference as distance increases, the heavier arrow is going to keep more of its speed. The lighter arrow is going to experience more drag and is going to slow down faster. So when choosing an arrow, don't worry about speed. Don't even think about speed. Choose an arrow that shoots out of your bow well. Choose an arrow that is going to give you the right spine, and choose an arrow that's going to give you good momentum. All right, the last thing I'd like to talk about is the time a game animal has to dodge a shot. By subtracting the speed of sound and reaction time variables from the time it takes the arrow to reach the target, I was able to determine the amount of time the animal has to dodge a shot. For these calculations, I use my hunting arrow, or my heaviest arrow. At 10 yards, the arrow reaches the animal in 0.112 seconds. By subtracting the animal's audio to brain reaction time of 0.01 seconds and the brain to muscle reaction time of 0.04 seconds and the speed of sound of 0.0266 seconds, I come up with a time of 0.035 seconds for the animal to dodge the shot. So the animal has 35 milliseconds, faster than the fastest blink of an eye by far, to dodge a shot, and that's a time nearly impossible at 10 yards for the animal to dodge a shot. As a rule of thumb, as distance increases, the time an animal has to react to the shot also increases. So an example of this, my same arrow will reach the 40-yard target in 0.460 seconds. The audio of the shot, or the speed of sound, will reach the animal at that same distance in 0.1066 seconds. And the audio to brain and brain to muscle stimulation will remain constant at 0.01 and 0.04 seconds. So by subtracting these numbers, I get a total time of 0.303 seconds that the animal has to react to the shot. And that was at 40 yards. Basically, that's the same amount it takes one to blink an eye. And as I mentioned before, this is in a perfect world without the surprise factor. So as hunters, we watch YouTube videos, we watch hunting videos, animals are ducking arrows and dodging out of the way and stuff. But if you watch those videos, in most cases, the animal is already aware of the hunter's presence. In so many of them that I see, the hunter pulls back, shooting at 40 yards, shoots their arrow, and the animal ducks it or gets out of the way. But the animal's looking at them, or the animal's alert and already senses that there's danger or somebody's presence there. Their muscles are already tense, so they're already ready to spring. They're not relaxed, and that basically takes out the entire surprise factor. So that is a huge, huge, huge key for hunting. Choose your shots wisely, and I'll be talking about that later. The last part of my article in this recording, I'd like to go through with a few things that I think matter more than speed. And I talked with a bunch of my friends, guys I hunt with, guys on my staff, and we discussed this and came up with a few things that, in our opinion, matter more than speed. And these are variables that we think that you should take into consideration more than how fast your arrow is. One of those is broadhead selection. So more importantly than having an arrow that is fast and light is choosing a broadhead that is both durable, flies straight, and penetrates well. I personally like to use fixed blades heads, but I'll use mechanicals in certain situations. Remember that a mechanical broadhead is going to have a greater cutting diameter than a fixed blade. A lot of those mechanicals, I mean, they're an inch and a half cutting diameter, whereas fixed blades, you're going to get 3/4 inch, 1 inch maybe out of them, inch and an eighth. Um, this is going to slow down your arrow by adding greater resistance upon penetration. Like if you hit ribs or something with your mechanicals, or you hit a shoulder blade, they're going to open up and they're going to need much more momentum, much more force to get through that shoulder blade, to get through those ribs as compared to a fixed blade. So therefore, you're going to want to use a heavier arrow with more momentum to drive the arrow further into the target when using mechanicals. As a hunter, like I said, our goal is to ensure a quick kill and minimize suffering as much as possible. So broadhead selection, that's one thing that we think matters more than speed. Front of center. Front of center is the percentage of arrow weight situated forward of center point. You want to have a well-balanced arrow that flies extremely well. An arrow with a front of center that is too low or high will experience erratic flight. We discussed this. There's a lot of articles online. We talked about it, and we came up with a front of center somewhere between 12 to 18% is a great place to shoot for. And like I mentioned, that's what we shoot for, and that's what we recommend. Another thing I'd like to talk about, and this one, as far as I'm concerned, is huge, and that's shot selection. Choosing your shot plays a much, much more important role in hunting success than having a fast arrow and the best bow. For instance, taking a shot at an animal that has sensed your presence, has you in their peripheral, or spotted or winded you, completely removes the surprise factor. And that's due to the fact the animal already knows you're there. It already knows there's a predator there, and it's ready to spring, it's ready for flight. If the animal spotted you, the speed of sound factor is completely removed from the equation. Movement gets to an animal instantly, sound does not. If the animal doesn't see you, the only way, like I mentioned before, it knows a shot was taken is to hear it, and it takes a little bit for that sound, that was a time variable, to get to the animal. In addition to that, take good shots. I see so many videos of hunters taking Robin Hood style shots. They're like, oh, I just shot this deer at 100 yards, and how many times are you going to hit a deer at 100 yards? That's just a terrible, terrible, irresponsible practice. Nobody should be doing that. If you're doing that, you shouldn't be hunting. Or I've seen them taking shots too at animals angled away in such a way that it's probably going to be result in a wounded animal, or just terrible shots. They're pushing shots. They're like, oh, I see an animal, I got to shoot it. No, you don't have to shoot it. Enjoy your time out in the woods. Choose your shots wisely. If you don't have the shot, don't take it. I don't take a lot of shots just because I don't have the shot. But I look at it as I love being outdoors. I love being in the fall, out in the woods in the fall, my favorite time of year. If I don't shoot my deer right away, that just means I'm out there for another day, and it's awesome. There's meat hunters, and you want to put your deer in the freezer right away. I've been like that some years, depending on the year, but that's cool too, no problem. But if you don't have the shot, the whole point is don't take the shot. All right, another big one is bow selection. So at Hobby Game Calls, Hobby Outdoors, we mentor a lot of young hunters. Our whole purpose is to get people involved in the outdoors. We run hunting clinics, we take out disabled vets and a lot of youth hunters on guided hunts. And our goal, like I said, is just to get people involved in the outdoors. One thing that we tell the youth is when purchasing their bow, get one that fits them and that they can shoot well. Having a bow that you can shoot well and can consistently achieve good arrow groupings is much more important than having a fast arrow or a speed bow. I ran some tests on speed bows. I made a recording and there's a blog on it. So take a look at that and you can see a lot of it ties in with arrow weight. Some of the articles similar, but you can see the differences there and our findings. If you can't shoot a bow accurately and with confidence, how are you going to shoot when the moment of truth comes along? So bow cycle and smoothness is also very important. Faster bows tend to jump a little more due to the violent nature required to get the extra speed out of the bow. But just go shoot a bunch of bows, go to your shop, take some time. Don't let them try to sell you a speed bow. I will tell you right now that just like arrows, it doesn't matter the difference. I shot a 295 feet per second bow and a 360 feet per second bow, the IBO ratings, and literally the difference was less than a blink of an eye. Same with arrows. So go check out that article, you'll see. All right, so choose a bow that fits you well. That's huge. Another one is scent and concealment. So we talked a lot about losing the surprise factor. Scent and concealment play a huge role in the surprise factor. If you're not able to control your scent and play the wind correctly, you run the risk of the animal winding or spotting you and lose the surprise factor. Keep this in mind when you're out in the field. Check the wind constantly and make sure you're well concealed. Wear a camo that works well in your area. I've seen some camos out there that are so dark. I've spotted people across the field. They look like a black bear up in a tree. So make sure your camo matches your environment. One thing I don't hardly ever see anymore is people with little bottles of, like, say, talcum powder. They give a little puff on the bottle and it sends a little puff of smoke out, and you can see what the thermals are doing, which way the wind's going. I carry one with me all the time. Last year I bought a wind scent grenade unit. It just has a little stick that goes inside the grenade. You squeeze it every once in a while. Puff of smoke comes out and it's scented, and it tells you exactly what the wind's doing. You can see where it goes. I've been out hunting before, and I swear the wind's blowing one direction. I give a little puff on that, it swirls and drops straight to the ground, right to where the animals are. And you'd never know that in some cases if you didn't have one of those scent bottles or a bottle of talcum powder. So that's huge. I would carry one with you out in the field. And also, don't rely on scent eliminating systems. Those electronic systems, don't don't put your whole hunt on one of those systems. They work, yes, definitely, but be a smart hunter. Know the wind, check the wind. You can use those, they're fine, but just make sure you know what the wind's doing. And also, along with that, scent elimination clothing. Don't rely on that 100%. I mean, it works great, but you still got scent on the outside of your clothing. I like to air my clothing on outdoors, put it in totes, make sure there's scent that's not hitting my clothing. I change outside during the hunt, and just make sure that you don't rely on scent elimination clothing 100%. Another big one is bow tuning. Having a properly tuned bow with arrows that fly well is crucial for hunting success. If you shoot fixed blade broadheads, we talked about this, tune your bow to them before you go out on a hunt. I've seen so many hunters just nailing bullseyes left and right all summer long with their field points. And then when they go to fling a couple of broadheads, they're flying all over the place. They can't hit the bullseye. Broadheads fly differently than field points, fixed blades especially. So make sure you tune your bow to those fixed blades and make sure that they're hitting right before you go out on a hunt. Having a properly tuned bow is huge. Practice is another huge one. Shooting your bow in a number of positions and distances before the season begins is a great way to punch your tag during the season. One thing that we do with the youth is when we have our field days, we'll have them come over. I'll say just have a tree stand set up just 5 feet off the ground, and I'll have them climb up into the stand with their safety harness, because the safety harness, that tree strap is always getting in the way of your shot, and you should be practicing wearing your safety harness just to know what that strap's going to do, to know how to maneuver your bow around that strap and where to put it in the tree. Plus, if you're ever in a tree, you always 100% every single time should be wearing a safety harness. If you don't have one and you go out hunting, don't hunt. Hunt from the ground. So we have them climb up into their stands and shoot sitting down, shoot behind them, shoot from the right side of the tree, shoot from the left side of the tree. We have them shooting all different distances. We'll set targets up all over the place, random distances, just to have them get a feel for shooting from the stand. It's way different than shooting from the ground. Number one, you're on a little platform, and your footing isn't exactly like it is on the ground. You can, you're on the ground, you're getting perfect shots out. Up in the tree stand, it's completely different. Rarely is your shot ever the same as it is practicing in your front yard. Also, go through possible scenarios in your mind and try replicating them as close as you can. Practice from the ground as well, standing, sitting, kneeling. Go through all the motions before season. When the season comes along, it'll make you a more confident hunter. And when that shot comes along, it'll prepare you for that. The last thing I'd like to cover is arrow weight, and this is what the whole article was about, the whole blog, the whole recording. A light arrow will not fly or carry the same momentum as a heavy arrow. We've learned that. We learned that in this article. You've seen the data. We learned that a responsible hunter is one that wants an arrow that will have enough momentum to travel through the game animal. Of course, there's so many variables to hunting, you can't always guarantee a clean pass through. Arrows are going to hit things. They're going to hit bone. They're going to hit cartilage. They're going to hit the shoulder socket, ribs. Stuff happens, but shooting a heavier arrow with more momentum is going to give you better penetration when those moments happen, and that is key to harvesting an animal. Hunters try to tell me that they want to shoot arrows as close to IBO as possible to get faster speeds out of their bow in hopes that it'll reach the animal faster than they can dodge it. Take, for instance, the guy at the pro shop. That's basically exactly what he was saying. This is irresponsible and a bad practice. You should not be doing this. The main reason, like we learned, that an animal dodges an arrow is due to the fact that it has already sensed you and is ready for flight. Like I said, go watch hunting videos. You will see most, if not all, the arrows that are dodged, apart from the bad shots, are a result of the animal already sensing the hunter's presence. So when choosing arrows, pay attention to your spine, pay attention to your weight. You want a heavier arrow that's going to give you better momentum. So in conclusion, I hope that this test has been an eye-opener for many of you and that it helps make you a better hunter. I hope it helps you think about all the different variables to hunting other than speed. We have our mindset on speed, speed, speed. Everything has to be fast. The industry tells us speed. They try to sell you bows. Don't think about speed. Think about all the other variables. Does arrow speed matter? It matters somewhat, but compared to all the other variables, it matters very little in my opinion. So next time you go to select a new arrow setup, I just hope that you think about this test, think about the article, think about this recording, and that it helps you make a decision on what arrows you're going to pick. Traditional archers have been harvesting game since the invention of the bow and arrow, with bows that shoot super slow speeds and fling out heavy, heavy arrows. So just take that into consideration. Think about that when you're talking about compounds and their speed. So hey, good luck on your next hunt. Enjoy every moment you have out in the good Lord's outdoors. Spend time mentoring other hunters. Take them out and just have a great time outdoors. Enjoy it and stay safe. Thanks for watching this video. If you like it, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have a bunch of other videos that we're going to be posting. I'm also on Facebook and YouTube, Hobby Game Calls and Hobby Outdoors. Give us a follow and a like. And hey, thanks for watching this video.